Hey guys, what's up? This video wasn't originally going to happen. I didn't have a concept of it back when I was making its precursor, the video about Germanic sound shifts. However, seeing how well that video did and thinking more on the subject, I decided there is more than enough interesting material for this video, so here we have it. This is a video about the grammatical evolution of the Germanic languages, so here are the parameters. In some ways this will be a continuation of the earlier video, like that I'm not going to go over the history of the family or anything related to sound shifts, so if you haven't watched the sound shifts video yet, I'd recommend doing that now, or you may be missing some pieces to this video. Back? Cool. Along with that, in this video I'll only be covering grammatical changes that can't be explained by sound shifts. For example, I won't talk about how the Proto-Germanic pronoun thu became thou in English since that's all sound shifts, but I will explain how it got replaced by you. That being said, I will make an exception if it's painfully unobvious that a shift was purely phonological. Also, just because it's easier here, I won't do a big segment at the beginning summarizing the grammar of Proto-Germanic like I did with the phonology in the other video. I'll just introduce the topic-specific parameters at the beginning of each section, and the sections will be presented in the same order I do them in the language overview, starting with the sentence structure. Also, sorry, but I may have to pick and choose topics to save time and everyone's sanity. With that out of the way, let's go! So to start, as promised, I'm gonna just jump right in with the sentence structure. That being said, the actual sentence structure of Proto-Germanic is a bit unclear. Relevant to context, Proto-Indo-European was most likely SVO with noun-adjective structure, but then probably due to contact with Uralic languages or maybe other pre-Indo-European languages in the area, the basic word order in Proto-Germanic shifted towards SOV and the adjectives moved before the nouns. If I keep talking about this, it'll end up being a massive rabbit hole, so here's a text wall about Greenberg universals and how they apply here. Pause to read if you want. I'll also leave a link to a recent native lang video that touches on this. Anyway, it seems most likely that Proto-Germanic wasn't completely SOV, but rather had a system in which verbs primarily went at the end of the sentence, but if the phrase had multiple verbs in it, then the auxiliary would go right after the subject in the second position. For example, at the end of the sound shifts video, I tried translating what I was saying into Proto-Germanic, giving us the phrase meaning, I can't do an outro in this language. Here, the main verb donan is at the end of the sentence, while the auxiliary verb kan is right after the subject and the negative marker. But if I just wanted to say I'm doing an outro in this language with no auxiliary, then I'd say with the only verb at the end. Or maybe it would be second, we can't be sure of this. Also, V2 restriction probably came about due to the aforementioned placement of the auxiliary verb in second position, which would later get expanded to any verb. Speaking of which, time to explain how this syntax evolved. Basically, all the modern Germanic languages have switched to VSO largely due to increasing contact with other Indo-European branches, especially Romance, but with varying degrees of retaining the V2 and verb final patterns from Proto-Germanic. The West Germanic languages retain both of those features, while the North Germanic languages no longer have any verb final constructions but have kept V2 restriction. Therefore, the earlier, more complex sentence in Dutch would be Ik kan niet uitgang deze taal doen, while in Swedish it would be Jag kan inte göra niet gång i detta språk. While the simpler sentences would both be simple SVO, as in Ik doe uitgang in deze taal, and Jag gör niet gång i detta språk. English, on the other hand, went the extra mile. It stayed like the other West Germanic languages through Old English, but then in Middle English it went full SVO, making the two sentences above in English, I can't do an outro in this language, and I'm doing an outro in this language. English actually does have some V2 restriction, but now it's only done with auxiliary verbs like in the phrase little did I know, which goes along with the general pattern in English that the common European switch into VSO for questions can't be done to non-auxiliary verbs. Speaking of which, this is also uncertain, but it does seem that yes-no questions were VSO in Proto-Germanic, and in fact Proto-Germanic may be the original source for that feature of many European languages. So now, what happened to nouns in the Germanic languages? Proto-Germanic had a noun system with 2 numbers, singular and plural, 3 genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter, and 6 cases, nominative, accusative, genitive, dative, instrumental, and vocative. The gender of a word could be determined by the suffix, as masculine nouns in the nominative singular mostly ended in z or overlong o, feminine nouns mostly ended in long o or on, and neuter nouns mostly ended in ang, but just to be clear, irregulars did exist in Proto-Germanic. The case suffixes, which were fusional and completely different to one another between the singular and plural, actually depended on the vowel in the suffix, here called the stem. The main patterns were the a stems, the o stems, the e stems, and the u stems, along with the first 2 of those vowels followed by n, and some rarer patterns. So what ended up coming of this system? First off, some of y'all may have been surprised to hear that there were 6 cases in Proto-Germanic, given that the most cases in any living Germanic language is 4, nominative, accusative, genitive, and dative. Gothic only had 5 itself, adding the vocative, but yeah, case loss is most often explained by mergers, as we're about to see. Specifically, after Proto-Germanic, East Germanic speakers merged the instrumental case into the dative case, West Germanic speakers merged the vocative into the nominative, and North Germanic speakers did both of the above. While Proto-West Germanic is reconstructed as having still had the instrumental case, all of the languages in the branch had lost it by 1000 AD, giving us the current case system found in Icelandic and Faroese of the north and German of the west. Yiddish then went a step further and also merged the genitive into the dative, leaving just 3 cases. The rest of the Germanic languages went through even more deflection and merged the accusative and dative both in with the nominative, leaving the genitive, which ended up becoming acclitic in English, Swedish, Danish, and Dutch, although in Dutch the clicization only happened for proper nouns. Now about the gender system. For most of the languages and history of the branch, it hasn't changed at all, as Icelandic, Faroese, Norwegian, and German all still have 3 genders. But for the others, English lost all gender distinction around early Middle English. The reason why is unclear, but I'll leave a link to this Rob Words video explaining what I think is the most likely reason, but there is debate about it. However, some other Germanic languages, namely Swedish, Danish, and Dutch, merged the masculine and feminine to form the common gender while the neuter stayed put. But this may seem a bit odd, like, why didn't they merge the neuter with the masculine like the Romance languages did? Well, we can look at Icelandic articles to see why. It has to do with the morphemes themselves merging, not some kind of abstract thought. Icelandic still has all 3 genders, but you can tell that the masculine and feminine are a lot more similar to each other than either of them are to the neuter. Compare this with Russian adjectives, where the masculine and neuter are identical in many cases while the feminine looks different. This is basically where classical Latin was at, leading to most modern Romance languages having a masculine-feminine gender system. I'm not necessarily predicting that this is where Slavic languages are going, but it is a lot more likely than Russian developing a common neuter system. And finally, some of y'all may be wondering why the Germanic languages have several plural morphemes, so here's a bit about that. In Proto-Germanic, the main pattern for masculine and feminine nouns was is, while for neuter nouns it was o. This is why neuter nouns, especially in North Germanic languages, don't change in the plural. Otherwise, in modern Germanic languages, they mainly come in 4 forms, those being r, s, n, and an internal vowel change. We already talked a lot about umlaut in the other video, so I won't do it again. As for the others, r and s are both descended from is. The art came about due to rhoticism, which was also discussed in the last video, while the emergence of s is somewhat unclear, but might have been based on an alternative os suffix, or maybe it was due to word final devoicing. And finally, the n plural comes from cases other than the nominative, especially the accusative, where the suffix was often uns, but the dative and instrumental plural suffixes being mas and mes respectively may have helped. So now let's talk about the articles. Proto-Germanic, like other European proto-languages, didn't originally have articles. I mean, there was a heavily inflected set of general demonstratives which looked like this, but they weren't used for mandatory definiteness like the articles in modern Germanic languages. So where did the articles in modern Germanic languages come from? Well, to start, in West Germanic languages, the definite articles were largely based off the demonstratives, just with the extended function that was adopted in the standard average European Sprachbund, while the indefinite articles are all based off the Proto-Germanic word for one, einas, with all of its inflections. For both these articles, they followed the trajectory of deflection that we talked about in the nouns, and also sometimes became naturally reduced, as function words tend to do, making them effectively different words than the stressed words they came from, for example, that versus the, and one versus or an. Speaking of versus an is the older word. Throughout Middle English, the n was gradually dropped before consonants, leaving us with Interestingly, the same exact thing happened in Yiddish. The indefinite article specifically has lost case and gender inflection, but it did exactly the same thing in Yiddish as in English, where there's now before consonants and un before vowels. Speaking of Yiddish articles, as just implied, the definite article is still inflected for case, gender, and number. But remember back in the nouns when I said Yiddish has 3 cases? What I didn't mention is that the nouns themselves actually don't inflect for case. It's all on the definite articles and the adjectives, which we'll talk about later. Otherwise, the Dutch neuter definite article being it may surprise you, but basically it was dot in Middle Dutch, as you'd expect, but then the da got contracted off and the word was reanalyzed as being like the third person singular neuter pronoun it, and so started being spelled the same. North Germanic articles are a bit more complicated. For one, Icelandic only has definite articles, no indefinite ones. Also, the definite articles in North Germanic languages are suffixes. Basically how this happened is that this was a Proto-Norse innovation with jonas, a distal determiner meaning that over there. We get the word yonder from it. The pre-North Germanic speakers basically started putting it after their nouns and using it as a definite article, which resulted in it being shortened to just in. The till was just the neuter suffix and then swallowed up the n when the whole n disappeared and the consonant compensatorily lengthened thing happened, if you happen to remember that from the sound shifts video. Otherwise, what I said about the West Germanic articles still applies, like the deflection processes of the articles. Also, you know the definite articles from Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian that go before the noun phrase and only happen if there's an adjective? Well, those are pretty much just cognates of the definite articles from the West Germanic languages. Now about the pronouns. Here's the chart of pronouns in Proto-Germanic, and you'll notice they differ from nouns in a couple of ways. First, the dative and instrumental are identical for pronouns, but also there's a dual number. Yep, the nouns had already lost this feature by Proto-Germanic, but the pronouns had kept it. In addition to this, certain pronouns, namely those with a stressed a or long vowel, had an unstressed variant with e instead. So other than the aforementioned deflections and sound changes, how did these pronouns evolve into the modern ones? Well, the plural won out over the dual for the most part when speakers stopped distinguishing between them, except in the languages descended from Old West Norse, where the dual actually went out and became the plural form. This is why Icelandic, Faroese, and New Norse have plural non-nominative pronouns with k's instead of s's like the rest of the family. Also, if you're wondering why the second-person plural forms in Faroese, Norwegian, and Icelandic have an unexpected thorn D or T at the beginning, this is probably due to contamination from the singular equivalent. Moving on, the thing I said I'd talk about at the beginning of the video, English and Dutch replacing their second-person singular pronouns with the plural equivalent. This has to do with a broadly European pattern where you use the plural second-person pronoun to formally address one person, commonly referred to as TV distinction. In English and Dutch in like the 1600s, though, the plural forms were fully replacing the singular forms, which is the situation both languages have today. Also, the object pronoun replaced the subject in English, while in Dutch from the Netherlands it just contaminated the subject, giving us jij, but in Belgium the older form gij is still used. Anyway, this led to the pronoun groups being seen as primarily singular though, so what happened with the plurals as a result? Well, in Dutch they innovated an all cases pronoun jullie out of a combination of jullie, meaning you people. The unstressed forms of it are still identical to the singular ones though. In English, of course, various dialects innovated new plural pronouns, but prescriptivists don't like them, yada yada yada. But yeah, that's why English has you, and your instead of thou, thee, and thy, and why Dutch has jij, jou, and jou instead of thou, they, and dijn. So next issue, why is the Swedish word for y'all ni instead of I, like expected and found in Danish? This is actually due to rebracketing. You see, back when Swedish actually had verb conjugations, the second person plural conjugations ended with n. And since those verbs very often went before the subject, this conjugation suffix got reanalyzed as being at the beginning of the pronoun and stayed there even after Swedish stopped doing personal conjugations. A similar thing happened to certain German dialects where the first person plural subject pronoun wir got influenced by the n at the end of that verb conjugation, resulting in mir, which is now the official first person plural subject pronoun in Yiddish and some other German descended languages, while in Standard German itself it's considered dialectal to High German in the South. This thing also happened in Ninoshk, by the way. Finally, for the pronouns, we gotta talk about the formation of the third-person pronouns since Proto-Germanic didn't have them. As you may expect, the modern third-person pronouns are all descended from some sort of determiner, so I'll just run through some of the sources. First off, there was his, which meant this, and resulted in English he and Dutch hij. These forms also influenced the North Germanic singular pronouns like Swedish han and hun, even though those descend from joinas, which was mentioned in the article section. Another important determiner was is, which was just general in meaning, and that form resulted in German and Yiddish but in addition, a lot more pronouns came from its other inflections. For example, in the feminine it was sie, which led to Dutch zij and German sie, and in the neuter was it, which led to English it, Dutch it, and German es. There's also Proto-Germanic sa, whose masculine plural form was thai, and this resulted in Icelandic þeir and all the other forms in North Germanic languages, as well as they, which was borrowed into Old English during the Viking Age. Finally, the English pronoun she is a bit mysterious. Its most likely ancestor is Proto-Germanic hio, the feminine form of his, but sie could also have happened. Either of those options could have resulted in an unexpected shift to sh. So now let's see how the adjectives evolved. In Proto-Germanic, they were pretty similar to nouns for the most part with similar stems and suffixes. Like nouns, the adjectives were inflected for 3 genders, 2 numbers, and 5 cases, the vocative not being included here. But unlike nouns, adjectives were also inflected for definiteness. I definitely should admit that in most literature about Germanic languages, these are called the strong and weak forms of adjectives, but I have personal beef with that convention due to it being inconsistently applied across languages, as well as not being very explanatory of what it actually means, so I won't use them. What I will say is that Proto-Germanic adjectives took a different form depending on if their noun was definite or indefinite, the indefinite also being used for any predicative adjectives regardless of definiteness, and the definite forms lined up with the end-stem nouns in terms of suffixes. Also, some adjectives only had definite forms, namely ordinal numbers. I must say, it's interesting that even though Proto-Germanic didn't have articles, as previously discussed, the concept of definiteness clearly already existed in the language. Anyway, Proto-Germanic adjectives also inflected for comparative and superlative forms, with the comparative suffix being iso, and the superlative suffix being istos. So now to find out how this adjectival system turned out in the child languages, I'll just pick right up with the comparative and superlative degrees because they still exist today in all Germanic languages. Of course, they did undergo the deflection you'd expect that we've already talked about several times, but they're still here with the same etymological suffixes, and that's an achievement. As for the distinction between definite and indefinite/predicative adjectives, it only really remains intact in Icelandic, where the definite forms have really simplified. However, most of the other languages have a definiteness and/or role distinction on adjectives in some way. In Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, and Dutch, there's a specific definite form, but it's now become identical to the plural suffix. A difference between these languages, though, is that the North Germanic languages just mentioned don't have a role distinction, that is, attributive versus predicative, while Dutch does have this as it only does gender distinction for indefinite attributive adjectives. German and Yiddish behave similarly to Dutch, being West Germanic and all that, but they've retained more case and gender distinctions from the parent. And then there's English, which lost all distinctions on adjectives except for the comparative and superlative. As a side note, adverbs in Proto-Germanic are a bit tricky. There seem to have been a few ways to form them from adjectives, and the daughter languages don't agree on the method. The only one that really matters for our purposes is to just use the neuter singular form, nominative or accusative, because this is what North Germanic languages still do. Other than that, English innovated a new adverbial suffix li out of the Proto-Germanic suffix likas, which was just an adjective suffix and sometimes still is, like in the word friendly. The other West Germanic languages don't have an adverbial suffix. So now it's time for the verbs, which basically means a whole new set of confusing parameters to make inflections about. Be prepared for some egregious oversimplification. As for how Proto-Germanic verbs were, they all had an infinitive suffix of nang. There were two types of verbs, those being strong verbs and weak verbs. Are you getting a sense of why I don't like those terms? In this case, the strong verbs were those that form the past tense through a vowel change known as ablaut, and the weak verbs form the past tense by attaching a suffix with a d in it, which was practically always said the due to the allophone. For the sake of not confusing everyone, I'll call them respectively ablaut verbs and suffix verbs. Nowadays, the ablaut verbs would be called irregular, but I can't really do that because they were perfectly regular back in Proto-Germanic, even though they still only made up about 30% of the verbs. Anyway, the ablaut verbs had 7 classes based on the internal vowel morphing system, although for suffixes there wasn't much difference. The suffix verbs were divided into 5 classes, but with very uneven distribution. Class 1 had the vast majority of suffix verbs. Speaking of the past tense, Proto-Germanic only had 2 tenses, the past and the present. In terms of other things verbs get inflected for, there were 3 moods, indicative, subjunctive, and imperative, as well as a distinct category of conjugations for the passive voice, but only for the indicative and subjunctive present. There's also a dual number for verb conjugations, but only for the first and second person. As for how all that turned out in the modern languages, there are going to be a few changes. For one, the ablaut verbs have become gradually less common, as due to various sound changes and such, the pattern became irregular, and with that now being the situation, people can only remember the most common irregulars. Therefore, forget about the verb classes from Proto-Germanic. Modern verb classes are completely unrelated to that system. For one, verb classes in West Germanic languages aren't really a thing anymore. In the North Germanic languages, though, the new system of verb classes was based on the suffix, like these systems. Now for conjugation categories. To get the easy one over with, no more dual number. Simple. About the subjunctive mood, though, it's either completely gone or considered archaic in English, Dutch, Swedish, Danish, etc. It does still exist in German and Icelandic, though. There's also been a bit of evolution in the personal agreements, so let's talk about those. One area of difference in Proto-Germanic was the consonant in the second person singular present tense suffix, which could be either s or z. This is, of course, a Werner's Law thing. It's come up before and also affected the third person. But what this created was 2 different choices for that conjugation, which ended up being chosen differently by the later speakers. The z form, which would of course become r, got chosen in the North Germanic languages. It also spread to become the only present tense suffix in Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian. On the other hand, the s form got chosen in the West Germanic languages and then supplemented with a somewhat redundant t, resulting in a suffix of est, which is still found in German and Yiddish and was found in English until like 300 years ago. Speaking of that, West Germanic languages have undergone their own simplifications of the personal system. English, as just hinted, lost all personal agreement except the third person singular, and Dutch lost all plural distinction. They're all now just the infinitive. Anyway, tenses. No Germanic languages lost any tenses, but practically all of them innovated auxiliary verbs to indicate both the future tense and the conditional mood. Practically always would the same verb be used, but with the present tense for the future auxiliary and past for conditional. English, Danish, and Yiddish, for example, have both auxiliaries descended from Proto-Germanic wiljanan, meaning one, those being will and would in English, and ve and ville in Danish. Dutch and Swedish do the same thing, but with descendants of skulanan, which meant like must, leading to Dutch zulle and Swedish ska and skulle. For the other sources of the auxiliaries, Icelandic uses munu, which is descended from munanan, which meant remember, and German uses werden, which is descended from wirthanan, which meant become. By the way, the conditional forms for German and Icelandic are actually the subjunctive past forms, which of course only they can do since the other Germanic languages lost that mood. Finally, for the verbs, the copulas and their forms are all over the place, so what's up with that? Basically, there were 2 copular verbs in Proto-Germanic with slightly differing connotations. The modern forms beginning with v or w, namely these, descend from the main Proto-Germanic copula wesanan, while the modern forms beginning with b, namely these, descend from belnan, which referred more to a sense of becoming. Finally, the forms that begin with s, z, or a vowel, being these, actually descend from present tense irregular conjugations of wesanan, which themselves were descended straight from the Proto-Indo-European copula hesti, which didn't survive into Proto-Germanic as a lexical verb, but just for fun, if it had developed that far, it would have been esanan. There is one final thing to discuss before the end of the video, and it's the negative particle, which has changed quite a bit from Proto-Germanic. Originally, it actually looked much like it does in Slavic or Romance languages, being ne and going before the word it negated. However, practically all of the daughter languages have combined it with some other word or words to create a new negator. Take English, for example. It formed in Old English by combining ne with oisht, which meant anything, to form noisht, which eventually shortened to just not, the current English verbal negator, which has shifted to now going after the verb, much like in every other Germanic language. The other West Germanic languages did pretty much exactly the same thing, with Dutch nicht, German nicht, and Yiddish nicht. The North Germanic languages did something a bit different. Old Norse innovated a new word out of it, meaning one, and the suffix ge, meaning not, forming the word ekki. This survived into Icelandic with the same spelling, pronounced ekki, as well as Danish ige and Norwegian ikke. The Swedish prefix ikke also came from this, but for verbal negations it altered slightly to inte. So now, like I said, I wouldn't do this in the last video, but nu fando e kital do sprekuntalono. Magliko tueo zefta trio satnegos, hure suera to isti. Andiknikan recto no burdo fintano. So that's it, hope you liked it, and see you next time.